The war had cast its shadow over the village, a once vibrant place now marked by the subtle signs of a conflict that had crept closer with each passing day. Broken windows, sandbags stacked by doorways, and the distant rumble of artillery served as daily reminders that peace was a fragile thing. Louisa, a 17-year-old with a gentle heart, had found solace in the village cemetery, where she visited her mother's grave each week. This small ritual was her way of holding on to normalcy, even as the world around her changed in ways she barely understood. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and bathed the cemetery in a warm, golden light, Louisa noticed something unusual. A dog known to the villagers as Loyal was sitting beside an unfamiliar grave, his body tense and eyes alert. Loyal was a beloved stray, a constant presence in the village who was always ready to offer comfort to anyone in need. But today, he was different, unmoving and fixated on the fresh mound of earth before him. Curious and concerned, Louisa approached, sensing that something was amiss. Loyal's behavior was unusual, and Louisa knew it well enough to trust her instincts. The dog was not aggressive, but there was a guardedness in his posture that she had never seen before. Louisa crouched a few feet away, speaking softly to him, trying to understand what had him so agitated. The grave he guarded was new, the earth still loose and unmarked by the usual signs of mourning. Who could be buried there? And why was Loyal, a dog who had never shown interest in graves, so determined to stay by this one? Louisa hesitated for a moment, then decided to seek help. The village was small, and everyone knew each other, but this grave didn't belong to anyone she knew. She hurried to find Joseph, the old cemetery caretaker, hoping he might have some answers. As she walked through the quiet, winding paths of the cemetery, the distant sounds of war faded into the background. In this moment, her thoughts were only on Loyal and the strange mystery of the grave he wouldn't leave. Joseph was in his small, cluttered office at the edge of the cemetery when Louisa found him. The old man had been the caretaker for as long as anyone could remember, tending to the graves with a kind of reverence that reflected his deep connection to the village. Louisa explained what she had seen, describing Loyal's strange behavior and the unfamiliar grave. Joseph listened intently, his weathered face growing more concerned with each detail. Without a word, he grabbed his coat and followed Louisa back to where the dog still kept watch. When they arrived, Loyal was exactly as Louisa had left him, tense and vigilant. Joseph approached cautiously, his eyes narrowing as he examined the grave. "This grave isn't on any of the records," he muttered, more to himself than to Louisa. The cemetery was a small one, and Joseph knew every plot, every stone by heart. But this grave, with its loose earth and lack of a proper marker, was an anomaly. Kneeling down, Joseph placed a hand on the ground, feeling the cold, damp earth beneath his fingers. "This doesn't make sense," Joseph said, rising to his feet. "No one from the village has been buried here recently, and I know if there was an outsider's burial." His words hung in the air, thick with the unspoken implication that something was very wrong. Louisa watched as Joseph's eyes darted around the cemetery, as if searching for answers in the silent stones. The dog, sensing their unease, let out a low whine, his eyes never leaving the grave. Louisa's heart pounded in her chest, the mystery deepening with every passing second. "We should report this," Joseph finally said, breaking the heavy silence. "Whatever's going on here, it's not normal," Louisa nodded, her mind racing with possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Together, they made their way back to the village, the sun now dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows across the graves. As they walked, the weight of the situation pressed down on them, a cold reminder that in times of war, even the most peaceful places could harbor dark secrets. The next morning, the village was abuzz with rumors. News of the mysterious grave and Loyal's strange behavior had spread quickly, fueling the imaginations of the townspeople. Some whispered that it was the grave of a soldier, buried in secret. Others speculated it might be something far worse. Louisa and Joseph, however, knew they couldn't rely on rumors. They went straight to the local authorities, explaining what they had found and urging them to investigate before fear and suspicion took root in the community. The police arrived by midday, a small contingent led by Sergeant Markovic, a stern man with a reputation for being thorough and cautious. He listened carefully as Joseph and Louisa recounted the events, his expression unreadable. "We'll look into it," he said finally, signaling his men to follow him to the cemetery. As they approached the grave, Loyal remained steadfast, his watchful eyes following their every move. The sergeant studied the dog for a moment before turning his attention to the grave itself, noting the fresh soil and the absence of any identifying markers. Sergeant Markovic ordered his men to secure the area while he spoke with Joseph and Louisa in hushed tones. "This could be nothing," he said, though his eyes betrayed his concern. But in times like these, we can't afford to ignore anything unusual. We'll need to exhume the grave and see what's inside. Louisa's stomach tightened at the thought, but she knew it was the only way to uncover the truth. The sergeant gave the order, and soon the sound of shovels digging into the earth filled the air, the tension among the onlookers growing with each passing minute. As the police worked, a crowd began to gather at the cemetery's edge. Word had spread quickly, and now villagers stood in groups, their faces a mix of curiosity and fear. Louisa watched them, her heart heavy with worry about what they might find. The war had brought enough darkness into their lives, she prayed that this would not add to their burden. As the last of the earth was removed and the coffin beneath was revealed, the entire village seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the secrets of the grave to come to light. The tension was palpable as the police carefully pried open the coffin. The villagers gathered just beyond the cemetery gates, strained to see what was inside. Louisa stood beside Joseph, her hands clasped tightly together, bracing herself for whatever was to come. As the lid was lifted, the sergeant leaned in, his flashlight cutting through the darkness inside the coffin. His sharp intake of breath was the only sound that broke the silence, a sound that sent a shiver down Louisa's spine. What they had found was far from what anyone had expected. Inside the coffin lay a young man, barely conscious, his body emaciated and covered in dirt. His eyes were wide with fear, his breathing shallow and labored. For a moment, no one moved, too shocked by the sight before them. Then, in a flurry of motion, the police sprang into action, pulling the young man from the coffin and calling for medical assistance. Louisa's heart raced as she watched, a mix of relief and horror washing over her. The man was alive, but barely whatever he had been through had left him on the brink of death. As the medics arrived and began to treat the young man, the villagers erupted in murmurs, their speculations turning into wild theories. How had he ended up there? Who had buried him alive, and why? The sergeant's face was grim as he surveyed the scene, his mind clearly racing with the implications of this discovery. "We need to secure the area and get him to the hospital immediately," he ordered, his voice cutting through the noise. Loyal, who had been watching intently, finally seemed to relax, sensing that the worst was over. As the medics prepared to transport the young man, Louisa couldn't tear her eyes away from him. He looked so fragile, so lost, and yet there was a spark of life in his eyes that hinted at the horrors he had endured. The police began to cordon off the area, instructing the villagers to return to their homes, but Louisa stayed rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. The mystery of the grave had been solved, but it had opened the door to a much darker reality, one that would forever change the village and its people. The young man was rushed to the nearest hospital, a small, overcrowded facility that had seen its share of war casualties. Louisa, still shaken by the discovery, decided to accompany Joseph as he followed the ambulance on foot, driven by a need to see this through. The hospital was a somber place, filled with the wounded and weary, but the arrival of this new patient caused a stir. As doctors and nurses worked to stabilize him, the police began their investigation, determined to find out who this young man was and how he had ended up in a grave. Later that evening, Sergeant Markovic gathered what little information they had. The young man, who identified himself as Ruin, had been buried alive by a group of men he described as soldiers, though it was unclear if they were part of an official army or some rogue faction. Through fragmented, feverish accounts, Ruin revealed that he had been taken captive as a form of punishment. His father, a wealthy businessman, had refused to cooperate with the demands of these men. They had decided to make an example of him, burying him in a remote village cemetery to send a message. As Ruin's story spread through the village, the horror of it gripped everyone who heard it. The war, once a distant threat that had crept closer and closer, had now breached the final barrier of their lives. No longer was the village merely a place affected by the conflict. It was now a stage for its darkest acts. Louisa felt the weight of this realization heavy on her heart. The world she had known, already strained by the hardships of war, had become a place where even the most sacred grounds were violated. Over the next few days, as Ruin slowly recovered, the village rallied around him. Though they were a small community with limited resources, they offered what they could: food, clothing, and most importantly, a safe place to rest. Loyal, the dog who had saved Ruin's life, became the village's unofficial mascot, his actions a source of pride and a reminder of the loyalty that bound them all together. But beneath the surface, the villagers were uneasy. They knew that the presence of such violence so close to home meant that the war was not just passing by, it was here to stay. As Ruin's strength gradually returned, so too did the spirit of the village. Despite the ever-present tension of the war, the community came together to support the young man who had endured so much. Louisa visited him daily, bringing small comforts: a fresh blanket, homemade bread, and the warmth of companionship. She could see the gratitude in Ruin's eyes, even though he spoke little of his ordeal. His recovery was slow, but with each passing day, he began to open up more, sharing fragments of his life before the war had torn it apart. The villagers, moved by Ruin's story and Loyal's bravery, took it upon themselves to ensure that both were cared for. Loyal, the hero of the day, became a symbol of hope and resilience in a time when both were in short supply. Children who had once feared the war now found comfort in the dog who had saved a life. They played with him, fed him, and even made a small bed for him outside the hospital where Ruin was staying. It was a small act, but in these dark times, it was one that lifted everyone's spirits. The bond between the villagers grew stronger as they faced this new reality together. The war had brought them closer, making them more reliant on one another than ever before. They knew that their strength lay in their unity, in their ability to protect and care for each other, even when the world outside their small village seemed intent on tearing them apart. Louisa felt this deeply, her own sense of purpose renewed by the way the community had rallied around Ruin and Loyal. It gave her hope that they could withstand whatever the future might bring. Yet, even as the village celebrated their small victories, they were all too aware of the dangers that still loomed. Rumors of advancing troops and shifting battle lines kept them on edge, and they knew that the peace they had fought so hard to maintain could be shattered at any moment. But for now, they took solace in the fact that they had done something good, something that mattered. And as Ruin slowly regained his strength, the village prepared itself for whatever was to come, knowing that they would face it together, as they always had. As the days turned into weeks, Ruin's recovery became a beacon of hope for the village. The once fragile boy, who had been pulled from the brink of death, now walked among the villagers, his strength returning with each step. Though he still bore the scars of his ordeal, both physical and emotional, he was alive, and that in itself felt like a victory. Louise often walked with him through the village, the two of them finding comfort in each other's company as they talked about the future one that was uncertain, but now felt possible. When the time came for Ruin to leave, the village gathered to see him off. He had been offered safe passage to a more secure location, where he could reunite with his family and begin to rebuild his life. The decision to let him go was bittersweet. The villagers had grown attached to the young man who had been thrust into their lives under such dire circumstances, but they knew it was the right thing to do. As Ruin said his goodbyes, there were tears and embraces, a shared understanding that they had all been part of something extraordinary. Loyal, who had never left Ruin's side since his rescue, stood quietly by, his loyal eyes watching as the young man prepared to leave. Ruin knelt beside the dog, his hand resting gently on Loyal's head. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Loyal had done more than save Ruin's life. He had brought a community together in a time of war, reminding them of the power of loyalty and love. As Ruin's car pulled away, Loyal remained, choosing to stay with the villagers who had become his family. Life in the village gradually returned to a semblance of normalcy, though the events of those weeks had left a lasting impact on everyone. The war still raged on, and the future remained uncertain, but the village was stronger for what they had endured together. Louisa, walking through the cemetery where it had all begun, paused by the now empty grave. The earth had been filled in, the site marked with a simple stone that bore no name. It was a reminder of the darkness they had faced, but also of the light they had found in each other. And as she looked out over the village, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, united by the bonds they had forged in the shadows of war.